Hi, everybody. So this week we're doing an asynchronous module, not really a module, but just to catch you up for the session that I've missed. I'm going to put together this little discussion and give you some examples around literacy development. And then when we meet next, then we can go over this stuff in more detail if you have any further questions. Okay. So last week, we looked at language from a linguistic perspective, and we gave examples and talked about phonology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, language policy too. But what we were focusing on with that is the notion of oral language, okay, or manual. The language can be sign language too, but we were just focusing on the essential components that all languages have, linguistically speaking, right? And this week, what we're going to do is try to make some connections to literacy. Now, it's very important to understand the different domains of language. We're going to refer back to this quite a bit. And not only the domains, but to understand that oracy, okay, is the human innate capacity for language. So no matter, well, it depends if there's some sort of cognitive, situation that prevents language to develop. But barring any type of impairment, no matter where a person is, that person will grow up and develop oral language. Okay, that's unique to humans. Now with literacy is a human engineered technology. Okay, it's something we invented. So our species, Homo sapiens, have been around for 200,000 years. And so is oracy. Literacy is very recent in human history. We're talking mid to 9,000 years. So I want to emphasize the difference between oracy and literacy, but also respect the fact that we are very dependent upon literacy in our society. And so sometimes it's hard for teachers to flesh those out and see them as different skills because they're so intertwined. And we become good at making connections between them. So, but looking at language like this that's not my invention. Right? This is something that you hear the old OPA descriptors, and it's the same thing: receptive modalities and productive modalities. See, listening and reading, speaking and writing. Here's the way that WIDA fleshes it out, and it's the same. So you have the four domains, and they can be housed within oral skills and literacy skills. Okay. And that's going to come into our discussion when we talk about the foundations of literacy. Now, before moving forward, you also have to consider the pragmatic aspects of language, like the linguistic notion of pragmatics. And that helps us understand why we have certain perspectives towards others. It also helps us understand why we speak differently in different contexts. And so I just want you to think about registers, right? That's how you use language and the way that you speak along a continuum from formal to intimate. And think about, in a school context, what kind of registers are used, right? And like who is speaking in those registers? Who are the discourse, groups and what you'll see is there are times when it's very formal. And language is evaluated, and it's tense and prescriptive when there are testing situations, or when you're talking with like administrators or teachers too. But students also use informal registers with their friends, sometimes with teachers. And assistants and things like that. So there's not just one register in school. It just depends on the context, right? Now, understanding that is important, because it now starts to help us understand how to avoid deficit perspectives, Like deficit perspectives involve seeing students for what they aren't, which is very common in schools when you're working with multilingual learners, because it's all about what they don't have, meaning English skills. But are they lacking English skills, or are they struggling with specific academic or school-based skills? So that notion helps us understand students in a different light. Like, oh my gosh, they do have strong language skills. They're just developing specific, very rule governed, formal aspects of language use in a school setting. And that's what we're going to discuss as we move forward, is how to connect those other skills that they have within a classroom setting. So the other thing that I try to have teachers think about is, like, what is literacy? Like, what counts as literacy, and what is valued? What types are valued? Now, there are a lot of ways that we measure literacy. Okay, whether it's informal assessments, or students writing reports, or within math, doing math problems, or science lab journals, or there are a lot of ways that we look at how they're communicating their understanding of specific concepts. But it's very important to understand that the student might have a strong grasp of a concept. When they articulate it in written form, they're often seen as, from a deficit perspective, as wrong, because the writing that they're supposed to use doesn't match with an academic literacy expectation. And so not only are they penalized for their written production, but then it seems to teachers that they don't understand the concept. And those are very different skills and different forms of knowledge. So what I want to do is think about what is literacy. Okay, and I have fun with it. I usually like to do this when we meet as a group, because it's fun to play with rebuses. But a rebus is like the first initial type of literacy, taking symbols and connecting them to words. So random symbols, connecting them to words in oral language, and over time, eventually those symbols then started to represent sounds that were connected to oral language, and so on and so forth. But a rebus helps us understand what's happening cognitively when students read. And so this is a rebus, right? We've all seen these type of games, but you have two simultaneous processes happening when you read. Okay, so there will be a linguistic process where you are using your understanding of specific symbols and how they connect with language. But there's also a process by which you are using your cultural background and knowledge to decode what those mean in real life. And without either of those, communication breaks down. Okay, so this "I love you, my dear" is very sophisticated. Right? If you just think about that, could be just a dash or a line. But in English is a subject, verb, object language. Okay, so we know that subjects will start off an utterance or a sentence, and then so that looks like the letter I, which is also the first person singular subject pronoun. So that makes sense. We know that a verb will follow very closely. And so this pink blob is a cultural representation of a heart, but you have to have the understanding culturally that that symbol not only represents a heart, but it represents the meaning love. Now, love then is turned into a verb, because English is a subject, verb, object language. So I love. Now this one, right, is the letter U, but we know that that's in an object position, subject, verb, object. And so the letter U then is linguistically coded into that object pronoun, and it's a homonym. okay, for YOU. And so it makes sense. Now, the next one, they're more tricky because the letters here were decoded as words. But when you get to this one, you can say M, which is a word, right? The first person form of to be, like I am. But that doesn't make sense. And so you're like, okay, there's an M and a T. So that phonologically, we don't have that consonant cluster right there. We don't have the nasal and the stop put together like that. And then you have this funky looking spaceship or alien, but then you start thinking, wait a minute, culturally, that T could be a cross. That symbol is used in math. That symbol's to add. That brings things together. And all of a sudden, this becomes an I, like an eyeball, not I, the pronoun. And so you have plus I is my. And finally, you have this animal that could be an elk or a moose, or I mean, they have different shapes, obviously, but in your mind, you have that as deer, which when you write the animal, it's EE, but a very common expression, a term of endearment, right, is deer. So my deer becomes the object of loving. And this is really interesting because with I've had Ukrainian students in the past, and they giggle at this because even though this is supposed to represent the homonym, right? They laugh because in Russian and Ukrainian, calling somebody a deer is an insult. And so I have to explain, well, it's not the animal that you're loving, it's the sound of the word. But culturally, if you don't know that, it doesn't make sense. Now, that was an extended analysis of a rebus, but that's the same thing that happens when you have written forms using academic literacy genres, and you think about all of the punctuation and rules with all of that. So it's the same thing, right? Linguistically, you have to understand the symbols, but culturally, you have to understand the meaning. Now, there are a lot of fun ones to play with. Get back. There we go. So the life after death, right? That's a common culturally associated notion based in spirituality and religious beliefs and things like that. It's not unique to the United States by any means, but you also have to know the position of the words and interjecting the after the preposition of where it goes to have that sentence make sense. That's an easy one. This one is more complex. If you think about fairies and wolves and ducklings, okay, that's fairy tale, nursery rhyme type of genres. So then you start to think about, what are these ellipses linguistically? That means there's something missing. And so something's right in front of these words. So what kind of things what kind of fairies are there? Well, there are good fairies, there are bad wolves, and there are ugly ducklings. The good, the bad, and the ugly, which is embedded culturally in Clint Eastwood movies from like the 70s or maybe late 60s. But without that cultural understanding, that just would never make sense. Now, you also have to know linguistically, what the ellipses mean and top down. And so you use both of those to decode that particular piece of literacy. Now here, these are common acronyms representing degrees that you get at a university. And so when you look at it, it's like, okay, these are degrees. That could be an O, or it could be a 0. And then you start to think, oh, culturally, how do we represent temperature? 3 degrees, there's a line. So that means they're not above it, they're below it. 0, 3 degrees below 0. Now, these are puzzles too, right? So, but they're all based in cultural understandings of things from fairy tales and Clint Eastwood movies to specific ways of expressing temperature. Okay, or in the first one, based in religious or spirituality. So I've done this lesson so many times, and I did it, and so some kids were watching. It was out at Lakeview. It's a community in Pasco. When I taught it, I used to teach my classes embedded in a community, mobile home neighborhood. But anyway, so these kids are watching it, and while my students were solving these rebuses and analyzing them and walking through what we just did, the kids came up with their own. And so they were doing these songs and putting them up on the board, and it was fantastic. Now these were like second, third, fourth graders in a dual language program. And they, were classified as multilingual learners or ELL students at that time. And, struggled in school and the whole thing. Okay. But when the pressure of academic norms was taken away, they busted these out. And there are a bunch of them, but this one's really neat. They just busted these out and put them up there and read them to us. And it was amazing. And this is the Bruno Mars song, I Will Jump in Front of a Bomb for You. And I don't really know and there's One Direction, Baby, You Light Up My World like no one else. I mean, this is just amazing. And to think about how teachers could have their students do this and then connect those to the prescriptive academic way to write those out while the kids are learning how their representations connect to school expectations is amazing. So that's something that I encourage my students to do when they become teachers. Like, let the students use their creativity, and then you can connect it to skills that they're responsible for. Now, another thing that really throws people for a loop is these two semantic processes, homonymy and polysemy. So homonymy is the homograph and the homophone, and just two words that either they sound the same and they're spelled different, or they're written the same, they sound different. They might be written the same and they sound the same, but they are not connected etymologically. So they're not the same. They don't come from the same word, but it can still be very confusing. Now, polysemy means that it's the same base word. It's just used in with metaphorical extensions. Okay. And so these ones are related etymologically. They're grounded in metaphor, and they can really trip students up when you think, like coats or coat of paint, lids and eyelids, a ball cap, bottle cap, or even words that you don't even know are related etymologically, like capital and captain comes from the same word, like cabeza. In Spanish it's CAB, but here that's rooted in Latin. And so helping students identify those areas that are difficult when they're reading is great, because then well, it's not that they don't understand this paragraph, it's that they just struggled to decode specific things that they weren't familiar with. This also helps for teachers to pre-read so that you are aware of these specific traps. And then maybe you highlight them so students, when they're reading, they know, okay, there's something unique about this paragraph and these words within it that are going to trip me up semantically and make it hard for me to use my cultural knowledge to decode what it's saying. Okay, and those are real fine nuanced points, but they're super important. Now, these are great for for my teachers in this type of class or setting, to try to identify, are these homonyms or are they polysemy? Like, are they related? Do they come from the same word, or do they just sound alike or look similar, right? The bandage was wound around the wound. So those are homographs, and they're not related, right? They're just spelled the same, but they're pronounced differently. But for a student who's developing English skills and literacy skills, that would really trip them up. Right? And it's a difficult word to pronounce, and trying to figure out how they're related, and So that's something that you could highlight when you give students their assignments, or when you're reading a book with them. She threw a head of lettuce at my head. Yeah, so head of lettuce is a metaphorical extension of a head because it's the same size. We have like elbow macaroni. Like in Spanish, you have a diente de ajo. It's a diente is a tooth. So one garlic clove is called a tooth. But so we have a lot of those. They're called image schema metaphors in multiple languages, right? Upon seeing the tear in the painting, I shed a tear. Maybe it's a painting with somebody crying. Or is it upon seeing the tear in the painting, I shed a tear, like, oh my gosh, that beautiful piece of art is now destroyed. That one, they have to decode what the meaning is based on broader context. But then metaphor, like idiomatic expressions, you can be canned for flushing a pot can down the can. Huh. So here you have the verb, and the verb is not related to can, meaning being fired. Pop can, down the can like the toilet. And so those three are related in a polysemic relationship. I mean, so they're all from the word can, which is then extended to like a garbage can, or where you throw garbage, but then we call the toilet the can. Or if you're fired from your job, it's like you're being thrown away. But it's not related to the verb to be able to, right? And again, these are just specific things that you see in academic texts and not realize that the cultural meaning is so nuanced that that's going to trip students up. Now, as far as the production, it's really challenging when students write something and teachers hit every single thing that they made a mistake on from a prescriptive school-based setting. And they don't give the student credit for the meaning. Okay. And so first, teachers need to emphasize writing for meaning. Okay. And then you work on smaller skills incrementally, not everything at once. And this is a really neat example of how, honestly, like the spelling does not matter in most cases. Okay. Your brain can still decode it when you have the context of understanding what it's about. Now, this is about literacy and school. And so most students in my classes get this right away. But without that background and understanding literacy, then the spelling would trip you up a little bit. Okay, so the point is, the more you contextualize something and the more that you have students write for meaning, the form will come, right? The form will come, the punctuation, the spelling, the paragraph structure, all of that stuff. But there has to be meaning. Now, another example I like to use is having teachers think of this as they're taking the state standardized test, and they're going to write an essay. Here's the prompt, right? Lord, we thank thee. Now they have to write an essay about what that means and what picture am I going to reveal on the next slide should represent what they write about. Okay, because this is our context. And so most people say, oh, it's probably Thanksgiving, or they're at church, or it's a group praying or something like that. But that's, as a teacher, that's not what I told you to do. Right? This is, to me, is what Lord, we thank thee means. So your essay doesn't count, right? I mean, it's a silly example, but it just shows you the more embedded contextual support we can provide advanced organizers and videos, or connecting to their funds of knowledge and field trips, the more you can get students to understand the context, the better their comprehension of the actual written form of whatever you're having them do will be. So now let's bring it back to academic language. All right. So I often think that teachers, well, most people think that what's the language that's used in schools is the proper language, and everything else is just slang. I get that a lot. Like, well, that's not how you say it in school. Okay, schools are just one context. Right? And so when we talk about academic language, it's very nuanced, because within the school context, there are other contexts. All right. Now, I use this book with my students in my intro to like multilingual ed class. It's the authors are great. Margot Gottlieb, she's one of the designers and founding authors of the WIDA, program. And then Gisela Ernst Slavitt is a dear colleague of mine, professor at WSU Vancouver. So it provides multiple perspectives of what academic language is, and to show how intense it is. Okay. And there are things that I disagree with and I see differently, but it's a good text if you are interested in reading more about it. So they break down academic language in multiple ways. All right. And they talk about the purpose in terms of like describing complexity, describe higher order thinking, describe abstraction. So, I mean, I point out to my students that, hey, just describing complexity and higher order thinking and abstraction, that's done in places other than school. All right, little kids are doing that all the time. And so what I don't want you to think is only academic language does these particular skills, right? So it's connecting with how they do that outside of school and connecting it in school that helps them gain an understanding of how to use academic language skills in that context. All right. They also look at different dimensions, right? At the word level, there are characteristics of academic language. There are sentence structure levels. At the discourse, meaning the meaning and how things are used. And this is a way that you can look at any text to understand the complexity of it, and potentially look at where students might have challenges when they're reading or trying to write something out. Now, what you will see on the West E is reference to an old theory called Bix and Calp. So this is by Jim Cummins, who's probably the top most eminent scholar in bilingual education, right? Since the 70s. And he came out with this concept in the 80s and 90s to try to help teachers make sense of how their students can talk to them in a way that you would never know that they're an English learner. But in school and on academic tasks like writing, they are challenged, and they fail these tests, and they can't produce the structures that teachers want them to produce. And so this is the Bix is basic interpersonal communication skills, what he called playground language or social language. Help is cognitive academic language proficiency, and that's what he was describing as academic language. Now, this has been contested, and even Cummins has moved away from using it because it's based on a deficit view and doesn't take into consideration the domains of language. So basic interpersonal communication skills boil down to speaking skills. Cognitive academic language proficiency boils down to writing skills, so oracy and literacy. Okay, so the social versus academic also frames students as, oh, they can just speak it, but that's basic. They don't have the cognitive skills, but that's writing. And so instead of saying, oh yeah, students need support in developing their writing and reading, they're seen as not cognitive. They're seen as basic. And if you've ever learned another language, you know that speaking is not basic. Okay, and that's the point. Now, on your test, because it's an old test, it will refer to Bix and Kelp, and it'll say, what's of Bix and Kelp, which one is the academic blah, blah, blah. Or if a student can speak, but can't pass a test, do they have Bix or Kelp? So you'll see that. I'm telling you, it's been debunked. It's not sound, and it's based on a deficit perspective. But on the test, realize that that's what they're going to want you to answer. Okay, and we can talk about that more when we prep for the test in a few weeks. So the way I get teachers to think about that difference is to have them think of an academic context where language is used. So something at the school, language is being used. Can you identify what that looks like without social interaction? Right? So every use of language is social. And so that's why I disagree with this stuff. All right. You can't use language without communicating and socializing with others, even if it's with yourself. Okay. And so that's where this breaks down. There is no social and versus academic. Academic contexts involve social contexts. So we're going to move beyond that, but realize that they do distinguish those as different on the WestE. So the way I like to discuss academic language with my students is to get them to think about what are the Oracy skills and literacy skills that students need to be successful in school, right? And then think about, okay, what does that look like in different contexts or different classes or whatever? So what happens is I get a lot of, well, Juan, he's really got low language and he can't pass his test. And so we've got the little green dot on him. And I'm like, wait a minute, what do you mean low language? Well, he can't pass a test. He can't write. Oh, so he's still developing academic literacy skills. Yeah, he can't write. Look at his phone. I bet he sent 50 texts already today. Tell me that's not writing. And it's like, well, so it helps them walk through the whole process to understand it's not lacking language. They're just learning a new genre and context of language. And that's why dual language is great, because they learn the skills and the linguistic coding process in their first language that then connects to the additional language, which then hopefully makes a solid foundation to build on to understand content and be able to develop literacy skills. So they're not seen as having low language, right? They should be seen as having two languages in different formats, or in that they can use in different contexts. Now, there's also, I have an issue with the way that like we evaluate students' language proficiency. So this is from my daughter's WIDA Access last year that we just got this year, obviously. And so you can see that she, with listening and speaking, great, 6.0, but reading and writing, she's still developing. Right now, this makes sense. She's in a dual language program. And so her language arts is all in Spanish. So this is an English test. And so that doesn't bother me. Okay, because she's got really highly sophisticated academic literacy skills in Spanish already. And so I'm not worried about her development in English, because I will catch up. Now, when you do overall scores, this is where it gets interesting. So oral language, right? Listening and speaking, right? Listening and speaking. So you got those two domains. Then they say literacy, 50%, 50%. So you got both the productive and receptive. Comprehension, right? 70% is based on reading, and only 30% is based on listening. But the overall score is super interesting. So this is evaluating supposedly students' language or English language development. But when you look at it, so I got the big red arrow there. The Oracy skills are only 15% each. The literacy skills are 35% each. So that's super interesting that we're evaluating students and their English language development process based on their reading and writing in English. That's very common when you look at, even if it's not ELA or excuse me, an English ELD type of situation. In school contexts, reading and writing literacy skills are overemphasized. Okay. And so when students are seen as not having academic language or not having high language and not having all these things that people say, it's like, wait a minute, we are only evaluating their literacy skills and only literacy in a certain context. And now what I am really passionate about is getting students to look at, or teachers, right? My students are teachers, but so I get my teachers to then explore students' literacy skills outside of school. All right, whatever they do, and this is why I do home visits and all these other things. So they look at what they're good at. Is it Roadblocks? That's the game that my daughter's like hooked on right now. Are they into, I don't know, Minecraft or video game stuff? Are they into music? Are they into texting? Are they into, I don't know, shopping and helping their parents, or whatever they're into? You figure that out and look at the same thing. What are the oracy skills and literacy skills that you need to be, or you need to have to be successful? So football, I mean, I love football, and it always bothered me when people would make, jokes about football players being oafy and dumb or whatever, without realizing the intense amount of language skills that you need to be successful. Not just oracy, right, but literacy too. These are football plays. When you're in football, you get a playbook and you memorize the plays, and then coaches draw it up on the board. But you're connecting symbols to oral language. They have them written down, okay, and they have a syntax. There's a structure for it that most teachers couldn't figure out what that means. Okay, now what's super interesting here is to note that in football, you need strong oracy skills, especially to listen to the play call, okay, and to be able to communicate on the field. For literacy skills, if you think about reading and writing in football, you need to be able to read more so than write. So coaches do most of the writing. Sometimes you get like quarterbacks will have to draw up plays or whatever, but the literacy skill that's most emphasized in football is the reading skill. And this is something that's important to note, because in a school setting, we emphasize the written part too. Okay. But this is a common trend. So we think about cooking, okay, and all of the intense type of literacy involved in cooking. Now, I mean, they have YouTube videos, okay, that you can watch now instead of reading cards, but the videos are super fast. I'd rather read. I skip through the videos and get to the written part because it's slow and I can digest it and see what's happening. But you see, there are distinct skills that you need and knowledge of, numeracy and the like adverbial order words. You'll see when you listen to people talk that they will say commands. So you need to know how to understand second person commands. And again, like if you do a deep analysis, you can see that there's a lot of literacy in cooking, but the most emphasis is placed in receptive skills, right? You don't have to write a lot of recipe cards. I'm sure we're going to sell them, right? But again, this is another common theme that you'll see in different contexts, that there's a heavy emphasis on the receptive literacy, being able to read it versus writing it. But there are some other, contexts that are fascinating. For example, graffiti art and tagging and stuff like that, where there is a higher emphasis on being able to produce those symbols with rich meaning and everything. So not every context is heavier on reading than writing, but you'll see that that's super common. Okay. which then helps us understand, oh, okay, so writing and producing very strict rule-governed writing, that's something that's very difficult for people, to master in an academic setting, especially when you look at other forms of writing like texting, and we've made it more efficient because you use different symbols and emojis and acronyms, and that still has the same semantic meaning as a 5-paragraph essay. Right? So then it's like, okay, I can produce stuff, but now there's a specific structure. And now, so what you do when you see students outside literacy skills, you figure out a way to connect them to the academic. Like I showed with the kids that did the Bruno Mars and One Direction stuff. Get their skills and knowledge from outside, then you scaffold to what particular, I don't know, language objective and content objective you have, and work on it little by little. So when we start talking about academic language, it's the oracy skills and literacy skills necessary to be successful in school, right? Those are distinct. I mean, there's tests and all that stuff. But then you can break it out and not just say academic language. You could say academic math language, academic social studies language, academic science, and so on and so forth. And I have neat activities where we analyze a math text, a social studies text, an ELA text, and look at specific forms and symbols and structures and discourse, right? The way it's framed. And then you start to realize, oh my gosh, there isn't just one academic language. Every content area, right, it has very distinct rules. So that's another form of looking at where students are successful, right? What are they doing well in other courses or other content areas that you can loop back into language development, literacy development in English. Now, that is why, like when math teachers or science teachers, they have a language objective. So while they're doing a content objective-based lesson, there are language skills looped into that lesson, and students start to see connections between ELA and science, and to understand that everything is mediated through language. So yeah, it's a pet peeve of mine when teachers will tell me, oh, I'm a math teacher, I don't have to teach language. No, everything is language. Now, the last part that I wanted to touch on is a notion of multiliteracies, and understanding that reading and writing an essay or a book is just one form of literacy, print-based literacy, right? But students will have other types of literacy expertise, digital or visual, oral. There might be other literacies, and that's that they're using that you can tap into to then connect to develop their skills for the stuff that you're trying to accomplish in your classes. And when you do that, the students are, one, they're more engaged, but they start to see from a meta-linguistic perspective how those literacy skills are transferable, right? They just look different. The example I give, teachers is, okay, I want you to, for the next 10 text messages you send, I want you to use APA format, and I want you to cite and, use adequate, appropriate APA citation formatting. And it's silly to think of that, because that's not the genre that you use in text messages. Okay. So that's taking a very academic prescriptive format and putting it in a context that it's not necessary. And actually, whoever you're texting is probably going to give you the middle finger, right? Not even write back or stop replying to messages altogether. That's the way they say, no, you're not doing that here. But it can go the other way too, where it's like, okay, your literacy skills, let's look at those in a school setting. Cool, you have that. Now, how do we translate that into an academic form that you can use for other purposes or whatever? And that's when they get excited. So I want to leave you with there's no homework, but I want you to think about in your context, these two questions, right? So are there other literacy skills that you've seen with your students or noticed in your everyday classroom teaching or listening to them talk on the playground or whatever? And think about how you can tap into some other form of literacy-based skill, right? That's not a school-based academic literacy. And how can you connect that in your classroom? I keep drawing back to the Rebus that the young kids did. Are there examples like that you can think of, or that you've done? I mean, there's a lot of collective experience in this group. So, and that's where we'll pick up when we return, okay, for the next meeting, just to get some of those examples and start us to think how that works and how we can then use those skills to improve our students' understanding of content, but also the development of those academic content-based literacy skills. And so we will see you in a week.